So welcome everybody. This is the last in our current series of Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment webinar series. So welcome back to those of you who've been joining us regularly, and warm welcome to those of you who haven't. And we're recording this event. We will hopefully share it afterwards if everything goes well, but just to let you know that it's being recorded now. So for those of you new to the seminar series, Social Scientists Against the Hostile Environment was originally a project of the Special Interest Group on Refugees, Migration and Settlement, established by some individual fellows of the Academy of Social Sciences. And we work as social scientists on issues of racism and migration in the UK and globally. And we also believe in our duty as social scientists to use our research to inform policy debates and to challenge the hostile environment for migrants produced by current government policy. Our webinars, which we've been hosting more or less monthly since the pandemic began, have been about bringing together scholars and civil society groups to discuss these issues in the light of evidence. And today's webinar focuses on one key feature of the hostile environment. And I'm just going to introduce the themes, and the text that I'm going to base this on was written mainly by our colleague Anne Phoenix, who was one of the organizers of this event, but unfortunately can't be with us tonight as she's becoming a grandmother for the second time. In 2012, the then Home Secretary Theresa May coined the term hostile environment as a political strategy designed to make the UK unlivable for irregular migrants. Because it was a catchphrase without particular laws or policies linked with it at the time, it gained widespread recognition and expanded into negative everyday practices across institutions. The Immigration Acts of 2014 and 2016 enshrined the intentions of the hostile environment into the responsibilities of several institutions and individuals, making, for example, employers, landlords, university lecturers and others responsible for immigration checks and extending national borders into daily life. And the power of this political strategy is partly that it was built on something unsubstantial and imprecise, but emotionally engaging for that kind of political constituency who could view it as somehow helping to arrest the erosion of their living circumstances, the imagined erosion. The marginalization of people assumed to be irregular migrants seeped into the everyday and come to be taken for granted as normative. As a result, it's become easy to deny that it is a political strategy. Concerted practices that result from its ideologies are seen as simply mistakes or as resulting from popular will rather than as about politics. So, for example, the Windrush scandal, where Black British citizens born in the Caribbean were made redundant, evicted, denied healthcare, rendered destitute and even deported, was often framed as an accident, a bureaucratic accident, rather than as politically sanctioned. And this is just one example of the ways in which the legitimate belonging of particular groups become open to question and their claims to inclusion in the nation contested. The depoliticizing of the hostile environment allows political strategies to remain unchallenged in many areas of life, including the universities where many of us work. So, for example, the current Culture Secretary is contesting the right of museums and universities to take down statues of enslavers or to reevaluate the ways in which colonial histories are publicly displayed. Academics who talk about decolonization are removed from museum boards. The National Trust is attacked for tarnishing Churchill's legacy. Topics like white privilege or critical race studies are ruled inappropriate for university curricula. This webinar seeks to extend the conversation on the links between these kind of disparate events and policies in terms of how they serve to depoliticize the hostile environment and fragment political struggles. So we'll look at key moments such as the Immigration Act of 2020, the post-Brexit immigration settlement, which the Prime Minister suggests is a firm and fair immigration system, and the Home Secretary presents as humane and about social justice and protecting migrants from the exploitation of traffickers, or incidents like the Independent Review of the Human Rights Act launched in December, or the establishment and report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, the Sewell report, which announced the lack of evidence for systemic racism and the end of racism as a key factor. So, looking at these sorts of issues, our speakers tonight, we're really lucky to have three fantastic, important speakers, and I'm going to introduce them now, give you a little bit of information about them, and then I'll just briefly introduce them before they speak. So first will be Hannah Jones, whose title is Violent Ignorance, Confronting Racism and Migration Control. Hannah writes, researches and teaches about racism, migration control, belonging, and public sociology. She's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and her latest book, Violent Ignorance, was published by Zed earlier this year. And then Halima Begum will speak. Title is Britain's Tussles with Racism, Where Next? Halima is the CEO of the Runnymede Trust, which, as you all know, is the UK's leading race equality think tank. Halima's also got extensive experience in international development under both Labour and Conservative administrations, where she's been first secretary in a variety of overseas postings, has served as the director of the British Council in Asia, the vice president of the Lego Foundation. She has a BSc and MSc from the London School of Economics and a PhD from Queen Mary. And then thirdly, Frances Webber, whose title tonight will be Normalising Inadmissibility, the New Plan for Immigration and the Death of Asylum. Frances practiced as a barrister, specialising in immigration and asylum until her retirement in 2008. She lectured part-time at Warwick and at Birkbeck, and is the author of Borderline Justice, The Fight for Refugee and Migrant Rights from Pluto 2012, and writes regularly now for Institute for Race Relations News and Race and Class, and she's a vice chair of the Institute for Race Relations. So I'm gonna hand over first to Hannah, who has some slides, and so we'll give her a moment to share her screen. Great. Over to you, Hannah. Well, you're silent, Hannah. Well, you say you're not, it says you're not muted, but I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Has always won. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk about the depoliticisation of the hostile environment with such a great panel. I'm going to talk really drawing from the book that Ben mentioned, which sets out a phenomenon that I've called violent ignorance. What it looks like, how it works, its consequences, and possible ways to resist it. So put simply, violent ignorance is a name for the action of turning away from painful knowledge and for the further violence that that can bring. The choice to ignore isn't always a conscious one or a deliberate one, but it still matters. And by ignoring violence, we become implicated in that violence, continuing. Often the reasons it's painful to think about violence is possibly that we realize we're implicated, even if it's in a roundabout way. Most of the examples of violent ignorance that I've written about and thought about are concerned with the construction of national and transnational histories, belonging, racism, and migration control. And of course, it's sometimes something that people express surprise about, that migration control and racism should be discussed together, probably not the audience here, but in any case. In many of the examples that I've thought about, it's very clear how they're linked because they operate in similar ways. Controlling who has access to a territory and the right to safety and dignity in a territory is a process of deciding who matters. And it's based usually on where someone was born, to whom they're related, what material resources they have, or a combination of those. And racism, of course, comes in many forms, but it certainly includes enforcing different access to dignity, safety, and resources based on where a person comes from, to who they're related, and on what resources they can call. The failure to see connections between racism, nationhood, and border control, even when those connections have been explicitly inscribed in law in many cases, is itself a form of violent ignorance. And in the book, I try to explore these ideas using a range of examples. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on some of the discussion in a particular chapter, chapter 2, which is entitled Normal Violence. And it fits with this idea of the normalizing of the hostile environment. And that chapter starts with this epigraph from John Berger, drawing on his collaboration with the photographer Jean Moore in a book called The Seventh Man, A Seventh Man, which examined European migration in the 1970s. And these two images are particularly striking from that book. They're images of Turkish men being inspected by German doctors to decide their suitability to work in 1970s Germany. And Berger's caption reads for this image, you can hopefully make it out there, each man examined has his number marked in ink on chest and wrist. To me, these images have a visceral resonance across time of writing numbers on other people's bodies in order to manage and control them. It's resonant with the way Nazis inked numbers onto prisoners in Auschwitz. That's not to say the medical checks on Turkish men entering Germany in the 70s were the same as the horrors perpetrated by Nazis, but it's to say that the pattern of treating other people's bodies as numbers, as items or stock, is dehumanizing, and that writing a number on someone rather than communicating with them removes their agency. In reducing someone to a naked body with a number, they're made less valuable and meaningful as persons in that context. And it's shocking in part because when this system of assessing the worth of newly arrived workers to Germany was taking place, the memory of the Holocaust was less than 30 years old. And this connects those practices of the 70s to their recent past and suggests that memory can fade so very quickly, or it does for those who don't imagine themselves as becoming nameless, naked numbers ever. Berger and Moore state that it is unprecedented, and yet it is already normal. And this resonates as a description too of the European border crisis that aroused international attention, sometimes sympathy and sometimes hatred, in 2015 most particularly. So I'm going to focus here on the spring of 2015 and two experiences of the Mediterranean Sea that clashed on the shore of Kos in Greece. Tourists from Northern Europe planning on a sunny beach holiday found themselves confronted with the exhausted and desperate arrivals of unseaworthy boatloads of people travelling from Turkey and Libya as the most recent step on their journey to refuge. Beach as idyllic getaway clashed with beach as life-saving pit stop. Tabloid newspapers called it disgusting and reported that British holidaymakers say their summer break has turned into a nightmare as migrants who are in Greece to claim asylum have turned Kos into a refugee camp. I should point out my attention was drawn to this story by Bridget Anderson's discussion of the same Daily Mail coverage from a slightly different angle. In this story, you can see how the sight and sounds and smells of border violence was right in the holidaymakers' faces. They didn't act. This didn't act, rather, for those whose experience was reported in the Daily Mail, at least, as a moment of revelation in which they saw this disparity and their sympathies were aroused for another human. It was too much. It was too disturbing. It was out of place, as some of the captions say. And the response was a desire to push these lives and this knowledge away and to ignore. It was a request or a demand. That vision, that dissonance was a request or a demand that the seawater paddle on a pleasant beach holiday should not be polluted by a reminder that dead bodies floated in the same sea. Newspapers reported that holidaymakers' experiences had turned into a nightmare as penniless migrants who are in Greece to claim asylum sit outside their restaurant and watch them eat. Local restaurants have erected a net barrier to block the sight of the makeshift camp. But workers complain that the tourists continue to stay away from this part of town because they don't know where to look. How, asked the Daily Mail, could people be expected to relax when such things were going on? People were hungry, homeless, lost, and visible. And perhaps the answer is that people should not relax while such things are going on. But if they want to, they can do so by making sure such things go on in ways or in places they can refuse to see. We won't be coming back if it's like a refugee camp again next year, a British couple is quoted as telling a reporter. But a month before that report, a fishing vessel designed for a crew of 15 sank in between Libya and the Italian island of Lampedusa, carrying an estimated 700 to 1,100 people. They were also trying to reach European shores, and only 28 survived. 4 years later, the artist Christopher Burchell brought the recovered vessel to the 2019 Venice Biennale for the art world to see. This sparked a similar argument about the tastefulness of border violence being visible, this time among pleasure seekers at one of the global art world's major events. After the disaster, the Italian government had recovered the boat. to give a proper burial to our brothers and sisters who otherwise would have remained at the bottom of the sea, in the words of Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Almost 300 bodies were still inside the vessel, but others did presumably remain at the bottom of the sea. This was a spectacular attempt at memorializing the casualties of border violence, which cost around €9.5 million. In parallel, violence continued as the EU introduced measures to push back boats attempting to enter Italy, to camps in war-torn Libya, and reinforce border control within Libya, where migrants' rights and the right to asylum are not recognized, with a package of at least €46 million agreed by the EU for this purpose. Once recovered, the boat was entrusted to the city of Augusta in Italy and then loaned to Burchell, who transported it to Venice for the Biennale and mounted it on the harbour at the Arsenale, a busy part of the main exhibit. The making of this death boat into a monument raised questions. Some of these questions are part of a larger debate about the ethics of artworks which are based on real life tragedy. To what extent are they exploiting the pain of others, and to what extent are they bringing this pain to public attention as a civic act? What's the aesthetic or artistic value in such an act, and who has the right to profit from it? In the case of Burchell's work, questions were also raised about the specific incorporation of the work within the Venice Biennale, where moments of contemplation and reflection are short, where visitors hop from artwork to artwork, where rampant conspicuous consumption is so close and obvious, where an encounter with the boat may become an Instagram moment rather than a recognition of deaths at sea. This was accentuated by the boat's placement alongside a busy seated cafe area and without any signage. But perhaps thinking through a violent ignorance perspective, we might see this as exactly the point and the importance of this intervention. Placing it at the heart of wealth, power, and imagination at such an art festival means it becomes possible to both see and ignore at the same moment the violence of the world system that resulted in these deaths. Part of the artwork is the placing of this horrifying death trap next to the insouciant sipping of cocktails. That's what's possible in a world of violent ignorance. Hiding death and torture isn't necessary. Even when placed in full view, it can be ignored simply by staring it down, maybe over a Camparian soda. This artwork isn't then the boat, but the artwork is the reactions to the boat. The audience of the artwork is not the people on the Arsenale in Venice, but those observing them as they so easily assimilate or straightforwardly ignore its horror. And in seeing them doing this, recognizing this potential and practice in ourselves when we confront similar horrors every day, but choose to turn away. Barca Nostra is not simply a metaphor. It's literally the boat on which hundreds of people died when they could have been saved. And they died because of the unequal geographical and social distribution of safety and the means for a decent life, and of the power to deprive others of these. People's ability to see and perhaps appreciate this, but then to immediately continue with their enjoyable art appreciation tour is also not simply a metaphor, but a literal living out of a social process, violent ignorance. But we can also see this as a metaphor itself for how these processes play out in a variety of other ways through society, and that's where this becomes art. Coming face to face with people who've barely escaped drowning, or the boat on which hundreds died, forces a person to confront the violence of looking away, of not knowing where to look, even if a net barrier is erected around the restaurant to help with this. But there are other ways in which border violence is present in everyday lives, and rather than conspicuously looking away, these practices are incorporated as if they were normal and not unprecedented. The border seems like it should be far away at the edge of a nation, but in recent decades, people's entitlement to be in a particular national territory has become something that is not only checked when crossing over a borderline or geographical boundary. Bordering practices, as many scholars call such inspection and control, occur in everyday interactions, such as checking documents before being able to rent a house, get a job, take part in education, receive healthcare, open a bank account, drive a car. And because those checks have become part of everyday life, everyday people with routine, seemingly non-border related jobs, as Ben mentioned, bank clerks, doctors, receptionists, university lecturers, people renting out a home, have become border guards. So the border is never far away in places that have implemented such controls, which includes global north. People can be turned into numbers or into dirt, which must be expelled, or into problems which require nets, veils, walls, and oceans to screen them from view of the comfortable and keep us in our relative comfort. Even when those sheltering nets are torn, the violence that sustains our world can be easier to look away from than to confront. So what would it take to change that? One way is to get better at identifying the techniques through which violent ignorance is maintained by looking at examples of how the drama and violence of the global border crisis are ignored and able to proceed as if such extremes are normal. This includes how the size of the problem of border violence, the sheer numbers of people who are unable to find a safe territory to live in, can itself become a factor in pushing observers to ignore the problem when it seems too huge to even contemplate. A second technique of violent ignorance also uses numbers as at the beginning of this paper. Rather than numbers of bodies become numbers, where they're literally marked with serial numbers or treated as units for processing rather than people. In this practice of dehumanization, it becomes much harder to see the consequences of the systems that reproduce border violence. If those numbing practices are a way of obscuring the human stories of border violence, a more straightforward way to completely obscure humans and their stories is to keep them out of sight, as in offshore immigration detention and other forms of complete exclusion from mainstream society. But if violent ignorance appears to be enabled both by hiding and by making known, then how can it be challenged? I'd argue that one important element is the linking of feeling to knowledge. Artists and activists are best placed to do that, or I mean, a good place to try with that. And that can achieve punctures in the skin of violent ignorance that both challenge ignorance and enable connection.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It was lovely and perfectly timed. And I'll hand over to Halima now.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to everyone for inviting us to take part in today's seminar to talk about the hostile environment and the politics, or not, of the hostile environment ahead of us. I'm Halima Begum. I'm the CEO of the Runnymede Trust, and we've been working on race relations for a very long time now, since 1968. So this is very much the bread and butter of our work. What I hope to do is talk a little bit about the journey and some of that contemporary space that we find ourselves in at the moment. My colleagues never really let me out of the office unless I promise to tell you to follow us on social media. So please, can you follow us, and in particular myself, Halima_Begum. It matters because every time we go about and do our work, the good work that we do, I hope, we also get an adverse reaction of anti-woke people. So we're quite keen on building that solidarity each time we go and do a public piece. So thank you. So I'm going to build up a little bit from Hannah's presentation, which was fantastic, Hannah. Thank you very much for setting the scene. And I'm going to start with why immigration and race kind of matters and why sometimes they've been disconnected. We've always said at the Runnymede Trust, or maybe in the race sector, that whenever the government of the day is liberal on immigration, they're quite hard on race. Whenever they're hard on race, they're soft on immigration. And sometimes, you know, you work out, okay, depending on which decade it is, where are we on at the moment? What's really tough, I think, in 2020 and 2021 is that we're hard on immigration and we're hard on race. Now that should tell you something about the political landscape that we operate in. And this is something that I think a lot of civil society organizations and academic researchers will have seen coming. And because they will have seen this coming with the onset of Brexit and what we're now experiencing as the kind of Brexit hangover, is this attempt to just keep dividing different parts of British society, so that those of us who care about human rights and refugees and immigration and so on, that we don't somehow connect our pieces together. And so we've been encouraged by a lot of our human rights allies to think about linking immigration and race and refugee issues together, migration. Why? Because there's something about the way in which immigration and race was positioned during the Brexit debate, which sets apart issues around migration and other foreigners, particularly foreigners that come from Eastern Europe. And we're very keen that that doesn't happen, that we see the same patterns and trends around immigration and race and how we were othered and marginalized taking place and happening to migrants from Eastern Europe and so on. But that's a very deliberate strategy that we see happening, and we're very keen to push back on that. I started by saying that the Runnymede was set up in 1968. Now that was an important year, and I'm just going to remind ourselves on why that year was important. And I know that the panel probably will know why 68 was important, but maybe some others wouldn't. 68 was the year in which Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in the US. It was also the year in which the then Health Secretary, Enoch Powell, who was very popular at the time, by the way, he's not popular in hindsight, but in 1968, he was really popular, and he was the then Health Secretary, and he made the infamous Rivers of Blood speech. So our ancestors and forefathers and mothers thought that something urgent needed to happen in the organization of civil society, so that all of that kind of public movement and protest that we saw in the streets around racism could have a home and an organization and a backbone. So prior to that, we didn't really have an infrastructure or an organization. Or maybe we had some of it, Francis, with the Institute of Race Relations, but it just wasn't enough to kind of contain what was then becoming the need for a public reaction and a movement to stop racism. Fast forward on, let's go to 1999. 1999 was also a pivotal and seminal moment in race relations, because that was shortly after the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And that's when we saw the publication of the Macpherson report, which talked about institutional racism very openly. And there was a public understanding and reckoning of institutional racism being dire and an endemic fact in British society. It didn't go far enough to, I suppose, set a legal precedent on how maybe the law courts would punish those of us who could be accused of institutional racism within an institution. But nevertheless, it set down clear parameters out of which various protections in the law came about in the Equalities Act, so the Public Sector Equality Duty and so on. So I suppose those of us who work in race relations were quite reassured that something of institutional racism was recognized and more action could be taken. There's never enough action, as we know, but at least there was a precedent that, okay, this is a national discourse around institutional racism, we'll keep going. And then in 2020, we saw the horrific murder of George Floyd. I personally didn't watch that video, many people did, but I think we all know that that was a seminal moment for many, many different reasons. For those of us who experience racism more directly every other week, it was anything but a moment, but a recognition that at least Middle England saw that racism was very real. Prior to that, that experience and understanding of racism was felt to be something on the margins, or it just happened to Black and ethnic minorities. But I think witnessing the murder of George Floyd in America galvanized pretty much everybody to the existence of racism. And if you ever had any doubt as to what structural racism meant or is or was, I think everybody understood that that action was not the sole action of an individual police officer gone rogue or a bad apple here and there. It was a culmination of a system and an institution that was reinforcing culture and norms that brought about an outcome where one police officer thought that he was perfectly accountable and within the law in his actions. So that was pretty devastating, and it took that much trauma and pain to discuss structural racism in the world, and in particular in the US and the UK. And I suppose the government then also was expected in the UK to react. And it reacted by setting up a bold commission that would look at ethnic disparities, that would do something. You know, in plain English, it would do something. And everybody wanted something to be done after Black Lives Matter. And I suppose the commission then was set up, and those of us who work in race relations waited for a few months to see what was coming. We were providing evidence to the commission, independent evidence that we collated with many, many other civil society organizations, including the Institute of Race Relations. We saw the evidence that you would be speaking to as well, I assume, in a little while. All of that was done in good spirit and good collaboration, with the hope that, you know, this government will do the right thing, because for once in history, the businesses, the public, everybody was aligned and meant well to do something on racism that would mean that we can make a difference in wiping it up for our children, but also the children behind them. This was also then taking place, I suppose, in a context of post-Brexit Britain, and all that meant in terms of a conversation around how we feel about foreigners and immigration. It was also taking place in the context of COVID, which then got us into uncharted territory in many ways. Who could have predicted that? And this was also taking place at a time when the government had an 80% majority in parliament. So the kind of usual checks and balances that you'd expect in a democratic country was getting narrower and less powerful in many ways. And we found ourselves caught in the middle of that storm somewhat. We always went into that debate with the understanding that we have something credible, sensible, and measured to offer on race relations. We don't have a huge amount to offer in other areas. I think, Oxfam offers something on ending poverty. Save the Children offers something sensible on children's rights. We offer something sensible on race relations. We don't claim to know much about anything else, but we do claim to know something about racism, racial disparities, and that interconnection between race and class. And then we found ourselves in the middle of a controversy that set us against apparently so-called experts who sat on that commission and were trying to do their job, and we were part of that civil society that didn't seem to encourage healthy debate. So that tells you something about the toxicity of the current landscape, whereby organizations and think tanks that are independent are being drawn into a different space where, although we ourselves will not want to be personal or individually hold anybody responsible for that report, we will be alleged of all sorts. And that's the climate that we find ourselves in. But we operate without fear or favor. We have challenged racism since 1968. We will continue to do so. We refuse to be dragged into any fake culture wars. We won't become a lightning rod for the culture wars that are raging. So where is government on the Commission on Ethnic Disparities? And the reason why I started off my talk as kind of Britain's tussle with race is because if you go back to 68 and 1999, you could kind of see a bit of a journey around people's understanding, both public and a policy understanding about racism. So in a spectrum, there's direct racism, people being beaten up on the streets, people being called names and so on. And then there was an understanding around structure and institutional racism. But where we ended up with the Sewell report was, I suppose, a denial of institutional racism and something about the fact that individual acts of racism was less common in Britain. That happens to be true, by the way, although increasingly we see the far right operating with license at the moment. But on the whole, people like myself are not beaten up on the streets. That is progress. But of course, that's not the only form of racism that we're contending with. And that wasn't the only form of racism where evidence was provided from many credible organizations. And it's this denial of institutional racism that really, really bothered and was concerned to civil society organizations. And that's where we find ourselves now, where the public on the whole understands and wants to do something on institutional racism. Businesses too, by the way. So all of the biggest businesses in the UK, and I would say even globally, want to do something on structural racism. Never before have we seen the public, civil society aligned with the market, the business side. They all want to see something done. And government and that commission completely misjudged that moment. And they still have misjudged that moment. I think they pretty much thought that, the public was divided somewhere, like we were in the 1980s. They completely misunderstood that the public and the markets and the businesses were all aligned. And that actually, in the same way that we want to see something done on climate change, because that's a zeitgeist issue for this generation, so was racism. So racism isn't something on the fringes where people with the KKK used to kind of do that thing, whereas the rest of us enjoyed our dinners and didn't really see it happening in our institutions and organizations. Most people and most policymakers now understand that institutional racism, which manifests itself in disproportionate outcomes that affect different racialized groups, is what institutional racism is. Even the Met understands this. The Met understands that stop and search rates are too high for certain minority groups, and it wants to stop that. So here you have an institution such as the Met that wants to do something on institutional racism, but it has a leader who says that institutional racism isn't a thing. So that's really difficult, I think, for the staff of institutions who really care, who really do care. And now we have a government who sort of watched that reaction, I feel, to the Sewell report and is, it's holding its position, to be polite. I tend to take a more generous view of life in general. I would like to say, rather than what is it that you said, Hannah? Ignorance and something about ignorance. I prefer the government is more measured and wants to take a holding position, and that it is responding to civil society. It'd be really interesting to see what the government's position is. So Runnymede Trust and other civil society organizations pretty much wrote to government to say, okay, we've had this report, we've had many other reports before, some are more useful than others, but what we're more interested in is a government's response and affirmation that it cares about racism and ending racism in all shapes and forms. That's what matters, by the way, not one report here and there. What matters is the Prime Minister's commitment to ending racism. And we are still waiting to hear where Boris Johnson and his government is on ending racism. We definitely saw where Joe Biden's government is on ending racism. We saw the announcement of Juneteenth the other day to commemorate the ending of slavery in America. And that took place, I guess, against the backdrop of what do we do with statues or not? Do we retain? Do we keep? Do we explain? What's more important is to commemorate the abolition of slavery. What's more important is to acknowledge the victims who suffered and that legacy of racism. Otherwise, it becomes an academic conversation about whether you hold a statue or not. What's more important is, well, if you're going to retain a statue, well, where's the rest of the redress and the balance to commemorating the victims who suffered for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years? So we have seen good action from the US. We haven't seen much yet from this government. So we remain in waiting. I was a little bit distracted about 2 seconds ago because some of you will know that there's an important report that's coming out in the public space tomorrow around why white working class groups are being left behind and are disadvantaged in their education outcomes. And this is the report of many months of an investigation at the Education Select Committee. Obviously, Runnymede cares about any group that's left behind or disadvantaged or marginalized. What we would say is that we want to see all groups leveled up. We actually called for government to commence the socioeconomic act of the Equalities Act, which would have actually protected us from class disadvantages in this country. Our government isn't committed to that yet. They would prefer to level up in other ways. But fundamentally, we believe that the 2010 Equalities Act had something very important missing on equalities, and it wasn't race relations legislation, it was actually legislation to protect class and prejudice against those of us who are working class in this country. So we're still calling out for that. But there was something really interesting in this report that you will see come out in the next couple of days. And it's this reliance on the family and lifestyles and communities and their households as a reason to explain, amongst other things, why white working class children are doing not so well. And again, there's no responsibility on the role of the state to do something right. We're just simply going to communities and families to explain their disadvantage and so on, but not really understanding, well, what is the role of the state to improve those outcomes? And particularly interesting is the fact that this government doesn't appear to be that interested in outcomes, because if you were to reverse those outcomes, you'd be committed to a structural equality of some kind, whether that was for racial equality, whether that was for gender equality, whether that was for equality within our working class groups. And that's why it was so important for this government not to acknowledge institutional racism, because that would mean looking at those outcomes and for the state to play a greater role. So there is probably an ideological underpinning there around the denial of institutional racism that seems to be seeping into its discourse and discussion around levelling up or elsewhere in gender equality. And that I think we should all be worried about. So any of us who are interested in equalities work should be really worried. And of course, the kind of current legislations that come under the kind of policing bill is very worrying, because as soon as you say racism doesn't matter, but then you start eroding all that other space for civil liberties, then actually the space for the migrant is pretty much eroded. There's no sympathy, there's no public compassion for Britain being a country that used to receive refugees and migrants. We're somehow becoming a country where refugees don't want to come to. So these are incredibly worrying times, but we are a healthy, robust democracy. And I believe that if we see that space eroded much further, I think the public will vote and respond in a different way. But before we come to that, it's important that those of us who protect the civil society space on race, migration and immigration continue to do so with unity and in some allyship. And thank you very much for inviting us to speak here, because we come in that spirit to kind of understand how we can link migration, race and immigration together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Halima. It's really important issues there, and I think that concluding note about solidarity is a really important part of our agenda. I'm going to hand over now to our third speaker, Frances Webber, and over to you, Frances.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for the talks that I've heard so far. Hannah's talk on violent ignorance was shocking. It was brilliant. The Pope described I think he described the attitude as one of depraved indifference. That was the phrase that he used. So yeah, I have a Tory, my MP is a Tory, and whenever I write to him about refugee issues, there's a somewhat surreal aspect to his complacent response. He always says, "This government resettles more refugees than any other European country. We have resettled over 20,000 Syrian refugees in the past 5 years. So that's roughly 4,000 a year. How does that compare with the million or so that Germany has welcomed? The vast numbers of refugees welcomed by Sweden, France, and Spain. Well, of course, those refugees don't count for, so far as the government's resettlement league table is concerned. The government is talking specifically about program refugees who are handpicked by UNHCR officials from the camps in Lebanon and Jordan, and not the spontaneous refugees who they want to ignore. They want to stop, they want to drive back. The inadmissible refugees who turn up in small boats in the backs of lorries, and who under the new immigration plan are to be punished for the manner of their arrival. So the eye-catching headline proposal in Priti Patel's new immigration plan, the offshoring of refugees deemed inadmissible because of their unauthorized arrival and their travel through safe countries to get here, borrows from Australia's Pacific solution, which the Danish government also seeks to emulate. There's a brilliant book called Death of Asylum, the Hidden Geographies of the Enforcement Archipelago by Alison Mounts. She defines the enforcement archipelago as a chain of sites of containment, a global constellation of sites where people and places are exploited to carry out exclusion. And that enforcement archipelago is already with us. So Mounts points out that for governments of the global north, the only relevant question is what will stop them coming? That question trumps needs, rights, or justice. And that is the driving force behind the new plan for immigration, which is built around punishment and deterrence of asylum seeking, which, to be frank, all asylum policies have been built around punishment and deterrence since, I think, the 1980s. So once again, in the new plan, we get tougher reception conditions. We get more detention, we get faster decisions, we get a higher standard of proof for claims, we get measures to prevent abuse by bogus children, that is, adults posing as children, to get better conditions. It's noteworthy, actually, that the plan doesn't talk anywhere about the protection of genuine children and the prevention of their being placed in adult detention, which a lot were, particularly in the deportation scramble in the run-up to the end of the Brexit transition period. Anyway, so we've seen all of this before. It just goes on and on and on. But for the inadmissible refugees who can't be returned to a safe transit country, and this is really the only new thing in the new plan for immigration, is because, of course, under the Dublin regulation, it was possible to remove inadmissible refugees who'd come through France, Belgium, etc., just by sending them back there. That's no longer possible. So now there's this offshoring idea, but which is basically, I think, a blind, because it's never going to happen, because there's no country is going to agree to take these inadmissible refugees. So in fact, what's going to happen is they will be assessed, they will have their asylum claims determined, and if they're found to be refugees, then they will only get temporary protection status with limited rights, which is actually illegal under the Refugee Convention, and with the prospect of removal after 2 years. That's a new departure, a new low, because up to now, whatever the hell that asylum seekers have gone through, A, to get here, and B, going through the asylum process, at least at the end of that process, being recognized as refugees, they then have been granted full rights and can get on with their lives, pick up the threads of their lives. What these proposals do, and this is the real cruelty of them, is to extend that limbo of rightlessness and insecurity indefinitely for recognized refugees. And that's where it emulates the Pacific solution, that basically these refugees never get to rebuild their lives. That's going on already in all of these enforcement islands, if you like, all over the world. So, you know, in that sense, it is already normalized. The plan is based on these two related falsehoods. One, the idea that somehow refugees are obliged to seek asylum in the first safe country they reach, which has no basis in the Refugee Convention. And in fact, I did a case in 1999 where the High Court confirmed that refugees have an element of choice as to their destination, and that they shouldn't be penalized for the manner of their arrival. So that's the first falsehood, or the first two actually. And then the second falsehood is that refugees who arrive without visas are somehow illegal. And again, another case in 1993, the precursor to the Supreme Court ruled that asylum seekers using irregular means to arrive in the UK were not illegal entrants if they simply present themselves to border officials and claim asylum. And actually in April this year, the Court of Appeal accepted this logic and applied it to the pilots of the small boats crossing the channel who've been demonized, convicted of assisting illegal entry, and sentenced to really steep sentences like 10 years, 12 years. The court ruled that they were not assisting illegal entry if their intention was simply, as they said, to be intercepted, to be rescued by border force officials and to claim asylum. There's nothing illegal about this. Yet somehow it seems to have been accepted that these two premises are legitimate. Although the government's assault on refugees arriving without visas is at odds with international refugee law and with domestic law. But who needs the law when you've got the right-wing media in full-throated support? But it does explain Patel and Johnson's war on immigration lawyers, the verbal attacks that didn't let up even when they provoked a racist knife attack in a solicitor's office last September. So Alison Mounts, to go back to the death of asylum, she refers to 3 types of death: physical, through asphyxiation or drowning or electrocution. The report that the Institute of Race Relations did with Gisti last year detailed 300 such deaths caused by the militarization of Britain's borders. Usually we hear about deaths in the Mediterranean, but these were deaths at the British borders. So ontological death, this refers to making it impossible to claim asylum through policies of externalization, which have seen borders and biometric population registers and detention camps right across Africa, so as to prevent asylum seekers from getting anywhere near Europe. So that's the ontological death of asylum, and the political death of asylum, which is the normalization process, which we're talking about tonight. Normalization of exclusion, the normalization of indefinite detention, of camps, of segregation of refugees and asylum seekers, the normalization of death in the Channel, the normalization of carrier sanctions and visas, which we don't even think about, but it's the carrier sanctions and the visas which are slapped on to the nationals of any country which starts producing refugees. And it's those that stop refugees from traveling normally and force them to risk their lives. And the normalization of the treatment of refugees as enemy aliens. So that process of normalization is carried out through in a number of different ways. Firstly, I think the delinking of policies from consequences. So the delinking of arms sales, IMF policies and corporate land grabs from the arrival of refugees. There is not, the connections are not made, the connections are broken between those events. The delinking of policies of militarization of borders with the consequential deaths. So the normalization is also carried out through the sort of common sense of border control embodied in visas and carrier sanctions, which keep out refugees, involving the conscription of transport companies and airlines as border officials. Nobody thinks about that, about, you know, of course you have biometric controls at airports. Of course you go through, you know, you have your iris, whatever, or you have your passport controls. And then of course, the relentless political and media attacks on asylum seekers over the past 30 years, documented in books like Bad News for Refugees by the Glasgow Media Group, and by the UN Human Rights Commissioner Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein in April 2015, who described the UK media's coverage of migration as extremist, a vicious circle of vilification, intolerance, and politicization of migrants. He pointed out that many of the stories are grossly distorted and some are outright fabrications. And we're used to it. You know, to the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express sort of twice a week regularly, these headlines, and very often coinciding with some government initiative, whether it's clandestine channel threat commanders or whatever it happens to be. So it's clear that issues of immigration and race have always been intimately linked, at least from the 1905 Aliens Act, which kept out Jewish refugees. But as the direct action in Glasgow, you know, the raid on the immigration van, which stopped those two guys being deported, the protests last weekend in Sheffield and last week in Tooting, the myriad activities in Refugee Week, all of those activities, all of the solidarity that goes on, as we know, from week to week in and around detention centres and barracks, and on the streets and outside the Home Office and at airports. So all of these normalisation procedures don't always work. Many people do make these connections. Movements of solidarity and resistance have always been strong in my experience and are growing. And if you subscribe to IRR News or to something like Are You Serious? Or State Watch's Refugee Observatory, or if you get emails from Choose Love, Help Refugees, or Safe Passage, or Care for Calais, you'll be aware of some of the grassroots solidarity activism which is going on. And more activists are looking at ideas of abolitionism, which is moving over from simply from Black Lives Matter and from policing to look at lots of different sort of areas of state enforcement, and looking at realistic and creative alternatives to border security and the enforcement policies of exclusion. There are better ways of spending that money. So yeah, that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. So in a second, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Georgia, who's going to sum up a little bit and then open up the conversation. I should have earlier introduced the other co-chairs. I already mentioned Anne Phoenix, but Georgia Donors from the University of East London and Michaela Benson, who I'm going to bring onto the screen, the other co-chairs, and Michaela's going to have the very difficult expert job of taking your questions and comments from chat and bringing them into the room. So I should also say, I said at the beginning that this is our last webinar of this series. I should say we will hopefully return again after the summer in September or so. So keep an eye out for our events. Before we finish, I'll post a link to our website. So yeah, so start thinking about your questions, and I'll hand over to Georgia. We've got about half an hour. We might spill beyond 6:30 if people are still going strong, but well, that's what we're aiming for. So Georgia.
Yes. Hi, Ben. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, let me start by thanking the speakers for such an informative and thought-provoking kind of conversation, because I think we've moved from Hannah Jones kind of highlighting and kind of mapping out this concept of violent ignorance that involves all of us, and then shifts in a way the gaze from who is the object of the gaze, who is the object of the policy, who is standing by, and who is looking at what is happening. So I think that you provided in a way the kind of the beginning for highlighting the cohesive landscape that we need to look for. And then I really like that Halima Begoun has so much experience that she really took us through such an informative history of institutional racism over time, because as we know, the hostile environment didn't just drop from nowhere, it has a history. And in a way, it was so useful to have this kind of perspective on what, in a way, might have led to it, and how there is this kind of double hypocrisy that is taking place nowadays and how it's becoming normalized. And then I liked very much Francis Webb kind of idea of this global connections of the archipelago that in a way shows that not only in the UK, but across the globe, there is this attack on asylum and the death of asylum, but also giving us hope by, you know, thinking around what type of solidarities we can think about. I just maybe in trying to connect the three talks to the topic of this evening, and listening to the in a way what might be running thread. To me, it seems that in a way there is this kind of, as we know, we've heard the key element of normalization of this, not just the hostile environment, but the depoliticizing of the hostile environment. So we need to add this kind of new narrative. So I want to say that for me, one of the first things that struck me around this kind of three presentations was that was referring to the power of language and how language has been used both in the arts, in the visual, in the legal documents and the reports, as well as in the media, to portray a certain picture. And the government is using language very, very strategically in pretty much defining and depoliticizing, using a depolitical language, such as, you know, fair and humane treatment, protecting migrants from exploitation, is the end of racism, we're going to level up, we're going to resettle refugees. So there is this kind of narrative overall that is about, it's a positive narrative, which in a way minimizes the politics and the challenges and portrays a rosy picture of we are doing very much, and almost situating the migrant, the racialized and gendered person as either the object of this kind of care and attention, the object of protection, or on the other hand, as the undocumented, illegal, the undeserving one, and therefore portraying the government and calling the nation to become the defenders of right and law and the rule of law. So I think that what is interesting in this strategy of using a language that is somewhat depoliticized, but has politics embedded in it, we can see how certain narratives are being, stories are being foregrounded, others are being kind of revisited. So when the implications of these rules of these policies on whole the population, the Commonwealth citizens, and many British communities have emerged, they're being again portrayed as accidents, so they're being minimized. And others are totally being left out, you know, so we don't know what's going to happen, you know, when all these obligations and unlawful, you know, policies that are limited and temporary are being implemented. So those kind of, what the implications of those are being left out and pushed away. And to me, it seems that in addition to the language, what you've said is in your presentations, that you've also identified that there is a sort of another way through which the hostile environment is being depoliticized, and we have a normalization of it. And it through what I would say is a strategy of fragmentation, is a fragmentation of, in a way, like from Halima Begum, you know, race and immigration. It's a fragmentation of, like Francis Webb said, about different, you know, policies and groups and looking at different sectors, but also fragmentation of expert groups. So we have the expert groups on one side and the other. We have the fragmentation of these everyday experiences, the fragmentation of institutional racism and individual acts. So there seems to me there is this kind of fragmentation that is taking place that is being used to, one could say, to normalize all these different acts that in and of themselves can be justified as being bureaucratic, as being good, as being fair, etc., but combined are creating an environment which is hostile, which is portrayed as being a good environment, but it's in reality a hostile environment. And therefore this calls, and I think all three of you have in a way highlighted what might be some possible strategies for in a way denormalizing and repoliticizing the language around the hostile environment and the strategies for fighting it. And it seems to me that all three of you in different ways, whether through histories or through art, have highlighted how we need to do almost a genealogy of how this normalization process took place and look at the techniques through which it can become exceptionalized, what are these nodes that might have been exceptional that have justified this transition and this then normalization. And I think that, and in this way, if we look at this genealogy of the formation of the hostile environment as a normalized and depoliticized phenomenon, on the other hand, I think is interesting in thinking about the future to think of what other struggles and other allies have done to, in a way, repoliticize other phenomena. And I really like the idea of borrowing from abolitionism. I also think that you've all emphasized the links, the importance of links, whether it's links around themes, race, migration, or around feelings and knowledge, or making connections between militarization and the deaths, or across sectors and local and the national. So I think that in a way, in order to resist and move forward, we need to rethink the language and emphasize and bring to the fore again and map out, trace these links that emerge. And I think that the task ahead is quite significant, because another thing that struck me during Refugee Week, which is quite an important event, is that you've all also mentioned in different ways death, how death has become, whether it's in the boats, whether it's in the, the death of asylum, whether it's in the ways in which, people, citizens are being killed in everyday acts and institutionally, sometimes indirectly. All of this, in a way, calls us to act quickly and create solidarities quickly in a way that is significant. So this is the task that is ahead, is quite a significant task and quite an important one. And again, as Ben said at the beginning, we hope that this forum of social scientists against the hostile environment can help us to create more connections amongst all of us. So thank you very much. It's been very, very, very rich for me listening to you all. And I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the audience. Over to you, Michaela, for the questions.
Yes, I just wondered if any of the panelists had anything that they wanted to respond to in what George has just summed up. If you had any thoughts you wanted to communicate now, or whether I should head straight into questions. Okay, right. Hannah's indicating very strongly, head straight into questions. All right, so what I've tried to do is kind of pull some of the questions together, and some of them will be more appropriate for some of you than others, but I'd quite like us to kind of have a conversation about it. So the first question that came in is from Fatin Kazai, who's a researcher at Goldsmiths in the Department of Sociology. And she was hoping that Hannah might reflect a little on Halima's observations. So what she said is, in terms of the terminology that Hannah's used, the ignorance, is it really an ignorant violence? When we consider what Halima described as strategical and ideological denial of institutional racism, to not do anything about it, is it then sufficient to inform and to educate in order to beat ignorance, to end racism? And she's got lots of quotation marks around things. If not, does ignorance really capture this the best?
Thanks for that question. And I'm happy to address that, because that's not what I mean by ignorance at all. And maybe in a 15-minute talk didn't have space to explain that. So as I said, put simply, violent ignorance is a term I'm using to talk about the turning away from knowledge. So it can be an active turning away. Of course, we understand ignorance in a kind of everyday language in English as stupidity or lack of knowledge, doesn't know yet, needs educating, and the things that were in that question. But I'm trying to think about it also as an active process, and a bit like in French, like the actual act of turning away, ignoring, deciding not to know. So not knowing in French is ignore. But I'm talking about the deciding not to know. So there's a whole kind of literature on agnotology, or epistemologies of ignorance, which is about the things that people don't know, which hasn't really looked at race and migration, but race issues at all, or very little, apart from work by Charles Mills on white ignorance. And he was also talking about not that white people don't know about racism, but that white supremacy, whiteness, is maintained by a refusal to know about the kind of experiences of race and racism, the experiences of people who live on the sharp end of race and racism. So what I'm talking about here is the people on the beach who saw people who've been washed up, the people who were the holiday makers who didn't want to see the experience of the Mediterranean crisis at the sharp end, clearly did know what had happened to those people. There was nothing hidden from them. There was nothing that they needed to learn about those people's lives to recognize what was going on. But it's too hard to know, because it means thinking, do I deserve a holiday? What does it mean that I am here on holiday and I have that access and those other people don't? There's a whole, and I'm not trying to judge those holiday makers either. I'm not trying to say they need to do better, because I feel that we're all implicated, as Georgia said. The question is how to negotiate that discomfort, that knowing certain knowledges, particularly knowing that one is implicated in systems of hierarchy and power, are uncomfortable, which is why we can often choose to ignore, whether we articulate it as not deciding not to see that or just refusing to see. I don't know if that, I feel like I'm just talking now, so please interrupt, Nicola.
I suppose the kind of the next step from that would be, you know, okay, so what does education look like in that context? If people know and they're choosing to ignore, then what are the steps that we need to take in order to what does education look like, I suppose?
So I guess I wasn't talking about education particularly, although of course many of us are in education here, but more about the connection and the feeling, which is why I think the use of art as is one technique, and the use of imagery or different kinds of feeling and connecting feeling to knowledge. So there's a kind of knowing something on the page, and sometimes people need more information, but that's not really what I'm talking about. There's a feeling of this is why it matters, which is what I was trying to get at. I used some ideas around the punctum from Barthes, Roland Barthes, who talks about the image that really touches and cuts through to you. And I think the trick of the way that what I'm calling violent ignorance works is that we have to function by acting as if all of this is normal. The hostile environment, structures of racism, that is how people get through the day, because it's how things are. And once you start to question, it's much harder. But there are some things when you can't not question, like the Grenfell Tower fire. No one could not look at that, but then very quickly it's easy to forget and not focus on what's happening, and to kind of incorporate that. The same with some of the spectacular moments of the refugee crisis. But sometimes those moments of connection do break through, and it's not possible to completely go back to normal. And that's the kind of, well, I don't know if we'd call it education, but that's the kind of moments I'm thinking are important for building the solidarity and seeing why it matters more than going on with normal life.
Thanks, Hannah. I think Halima wanted to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I did. I'm actually going to agree with Hannah there, because I think I understood her to mean very purposeful choosing of ignorance because it's more comfortable and actually convenient. So something a bit like climate change. At some point, it was convenient to ignore. At another point, it became inconvenient to ignore the crisis of the planet. I think with racism, we're probably seeing something quite similar, where whether it's Grenfell or whether it's COVID or whether it was Black Lives Matter and George Floyd's death, somehow the scales dropped, right? And you didn't get a choice to choose ignorance. Suddenly, everybody understood that the conversation about racism wasn't about them, because I happen to be white. It was actually about us, and it was our story. And when a conversation becomes our story, that can only happen at an emotional level. Like, it doesn't happen because a Runnymede Trust for 60 years produced data and evidence to show that racism was happening, right? It doesn't happen like that. It happens because you see those iconic reminders of actually a reality that you thought existed didn't exist. Lots of people who experience racism, actually, George Floyd didn't swing it for them. They already saw many, many more videos like that, or they experienced racism throughout their lives. But what changed was the rest of society understanding that this wasn't on the fringes. And that is an emotional, public reckoning, reconciliation that happens together. And I think for those of us who really care about these issues, we mustn't let it go. We hold on to that solidarity that the emotion brings out to do the right thing.
Francis, I know that you want to come in as well.
Yeah, for me, that is the question, is how to maintain that. In the field of, like refugees, obviously the moment was the photo of Alan Kurdi. And that photo in the summer of 2015 it did lead, I mean, just that one photo was incredible. It led to opening up of, you know, Germany's borders. It led to sort of thousands of people right across Scandinavia collecting things for, you know, ordinary people collecting food and clothes and for refugees, people giving lifts all over Europe to, you know, to the people who were doing that great trek across. So some of those, it's like there was that great wave of solidarity and it was just sort of total sympathy and empathy. And the wave surged and then the wave ebbed. And when the wave ebbed, there was still a few thousand people, you know, in Lesbos and in Calais and in Ventimiglia and in these various places, mostly young people, who have carried on that solidarity work, who've just carried on doing it. There's an awful lot more, millions, who have got back to their normal lives. And I suppose it is a bit like COVID. It's like we can't get back to normal, but you know, the current is pulls people back so strongly to so-called normality, to forgetting, to losing that direct link. And so, yeah, I think that is the question, is how do you maintain that? Or is it impossible? Do you have to wait for the next wave? How do you create the next wave? I don't know.
I think that's really helpful in linking to the next question, actually, because the questions come in from Sarah Kayambi about, you know, she'd already asked that, is this a change from normal? This kind of the shift in that focus between race and immigration. Are we seeing something more fundamental? And I suppose I'm going to turn your question back on you, Frances, which is to do with, you know, well, how do we maintain it? That hope, that kind of, you know, you said it becomes a small number of people, but, you know, yeah, I think that's the kind of question, are we seeing a deeper, more fundamental change? Or have we been seeing lots of small incremental changes, which will build up to something, I suppose?
I mean, I do feel like Halima, I do feel there has been a real change in this past year. The wave, if you like, of anti-racism, the wave against structural racism has maintained its momentum. I maybe don't have the same confidence in the corporate wave of anti-racism. Maybe I'm just an old cynic, because it is a marketing ploy after all, I think. But yes, I think it's just a continuing to push these connections. For me, it's the making and the pursuit of connections and continuing to do that, and that is happening. So, you know, Georgia mentioned, you know, the spread. Well, I think I did as well. The spread of the ideas of abolitionism from policing now to other areas of enforcement, other areas of like in immigration. But there's also the links now that are growing between the movement for justice for migrants and the environmental movement. People are beginning to realize that those things are connected, you know, and that there are climate refugees, that there are going to be more climate refugees, but not only that, that corporations are trashing the globe. and that there might somehow be a connection between that and the arrival of refugees. So, you know, there's that book, The Right to Stay Home, one of my favorite book titles, because it turns migration round. It's saying, we don't want to leave our homes. We were forced to leave because of, you know, the corporate land grabs, etc. So migration and refugee issues become a question of justice rather than a question of pure, simply compassion. I don't know, I'd better stop talking because I could just ramble on. But yeah, making connections.
Anna, Halima, any kind of thoughts on continuing?
I could try. So here's the thing that the climate justice people are wondering about. What do we do with climate extinction rebellion and all of that movement and appetite and public will? Because where does it push up into for the demands to be then translated into policy changes? And I'm actually quite envious of the climate sector, because at least, like, after the public hits the ground, they can go to a number of organizations like Friends of the Earth. They can go to all these private organizations that set about to look at greenhouse emission and so on for a bit of infrastructure and support that then might actually sustain some of that demand and public outrage. Unfortunately, in race relations, as a result of quite systematic defunding of this sector, you don't have those backbone organizations. So if you look at and global poverty or something like Jubilee debt and so on, there's a public, they hit the streets, they care about ending poverty, and then all the policymakers and shapers and academics come together to make sure that that's sustained and government then listens. In race relations, we've never had that. We've never had funding to the sector so that we're able to do something with that enormous public expression that you saw in the summer of 2020. I'll tell you something really interesting. I took up this job, and I'm not doing a funding plea here, but I'm just going to tell you what the reality of the sector is. I took up this job, was it 2020 September, an operating budget of 400,000 a year for the leading race relations organization in the country. I'm probably not going to talk about what your funding is, Francis, but you know, that tells you something about the state of funding for racial justice organizations. Now, obviously, being the person that I am, I'm going to do something about that. But it shouldn't have been the case. It shouldn't have been the case that organizations that work on racial justice don't have the funding to be poised to pick up that public demand, translate those demands into something that makes this government listen. But obviously, because of the pain and the trauma from George Floyd's murder, I do think that there's more willingness now to redress that and try and create that ecosystem for taking that demand into a space that matters for substantive policy outcomes. The reason why I'm more optimistic about the corporate sector, I'll tell you why. More often than not, I'm invited to the table by the corporates, not by the government. Interesting. So last Friday, I think I spoke to 600 people at Goldman Sachs. I think I spoke to 300 people at the Coutts Bank. I mean, I just can't stop invitations that keep coming from the private sector. And I'm wondering, well, where's the government? You know, normally it's government that's more on side. Anyway, I do believe the reason why I think government might listen is, look, if you look at the history of change, often civil society is ahead of government. You expect it to be, right? You expect the academics to be ahead of government. You expect government to sit somewhere and then be pushed to react in some way. But now government has been quite misguided actually on race, particularly because even the corporate sector is talking to me about structural racism. I'm having to keep up with them. This country, government listens when the businesses make the noises. So I do hope that that alliance between business and civil society might bring about more of that change. And if that is sloganistic or tokenistic from the corporate side, Francis, I think it's our job to make sure we don't let business off the hook. We want to see change happen now, whatever it takes. So even if other people move on, we won't move on, and we'll invest in that ecosystem to make sure that we don't lose steam. And that's what I'm sensing a change in. People know that they can't lose steam and they'll make things happen any which way they can.
Can I add a response? It's great to hear that it's amazing that you're getting all those invites, Halima. And sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I just think that's really interesting, and it just shook what I was about to say beforehand. So, but I think that thinking about the depoliticizing of the hostile environment and of race relations, I guess what I think is unsurprising is that government wouldn't want to fund radical organizations that are going to challenge it. So there need to be different strategies. So that the idea that if you're going to challenge power, there needs to be a strategy which goes around that, levers that in some way. And so civil society is always going to be having to find these other ways in. So using those moments that we've all mentioned and talked about that change the zeitgeist, that suddenly get people to see things in a different way and tell those stories, as people have been talking about, are the moments. And then I think, as Francis was saying, that Aylan Kurdi moment that really shifted so much, but then it couldn't be maintained. And it was really clever how David Cameron was forced to come on and say it promised those 20,000 refugee resettlement places, but only for Syrian refugees, only through the resettlement program. But it did make it possible for people who had been moved a bit to go, oh, something's been done. So that's also how this kind of moment of unsettling, recognizing one's implication in a horrible moment can be easy to step out of as well. So there's something about constantly reminding, and how exhausting that is for activists, and finding strategies to share and recuperate and keep, because keeping that violence of whichever aspect of this we're looking at in mind all the time is really hard. And that's partly why we need to understand that nobody can do that all the time. So those stories have to be kind of recognizing our own implications in this stuff, but also recognizing we can't fix everything as individuals or as groups at once, but keep these cycles going. And interesting to think about how to lever those kind of corporates and what they're doing and why they care, and how that can be pushed beyond what they care about as well. Is it maybe a new form of kind of retelling the stories and shifting stuff?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think there's obviously so much to talk about this evening. I'm not sure that we're going to get through all of the questions. I should just say that more and more are coming in as I'm speaking, and I'm aware that we're running low on time. But I suppose beyond that kind of what Halima and Hannah have just described around these kind of creating new route maps, I suppose, in the absence of other route maps, kind of trying to squirrel your way in those ways. I suppose there's also the question about how to counteract knowledge. So obviously you've talked quite extensively, Halima, here and elsewhere, about how that narrative about the left behind gets framed around the white working class as being the ultimate left behind community. And I'm sure that everyone here knows that this is a strategy which suggests that the white working class is exclusively white, whereas what we know is that working class inequalities disproportionately affect people who are racialized as not white. So this is a question that's come from Loz Barfoot about, how do we really, beyond obviously the fact that we're regularly mobilizing that knowledge, how do we how can we, I'm trying to think about how to reframe what they've said, but how can we actually move that knowledge out there in a way that works within these new structures that you're talking about, within these new routes for trying to remind people about the fact that the hostile environment is anything but depoliticized, is a political act. So. Sorry, have I just confused everybody?
What was the link between the white working class narrative and the hostile environment? Is that what you were asking?
I think it's around the idea that actually the depoliticization of the hostile environment is partly drawn from that kind of suggestion that actually we need to focus on the white working class, and that's why we need to, that's why we need to be tough on immigration, essentially, as a kind of narrative. So in the kind of mainstream, this is what kind of comes across, whereas, and it's incredibly pervasive and it's very, very strong. So yeah, Halima.
I understood that question first time around. That's because the reason for that, Hannah, is because as I mentioned, that the report on why the white working classes are being left behind in education was released or embargoed today. While I was on this call, I was thinking, God, I need to read that after this. It's going to hit the public space tomorrow and you'll read about it in the newspapers. But it's actually been building up for a few years now, isn't it? Like probably a good 10 years, this whole notion that this country or this government has focused on the kind of grievances of certain groups, but left behind other groups. And even this whole narrative around who's left behind, who isn't, suggests that somebody or some group has purposefully been left behind, rather than thinking about, well, state policy hasn't been proactive in investing in different parts of the country to give us the geographical leveling up that we would have expected. But what's really interesting now is that some elements are finding that discourse around left behind communities quite effective for mobilizing support, broad support. I've been very careful about what we're saying here because I did write a piece about this in The Guardian about 4 months ago, and I was reminded to be politically impartial on this point. So I am saying that I am being politically impartial right now in case anybody else is listening. But the point is that if you feel there's a national discourse that suggests that other groups have done well at the expense of white working class groups, that is very divisive. And that is what worries me, that this discourse around white working class group as though they are a separate group from the black working classes or migrants in general who are on low pay or in precarious work suggests that benefits and expenses are, zero sum, rather than actually if we invest in communities, investing in jobs, everybody's better off. The empirical basis of who is left behind, who isn't left behind is quite interesting, but it's not a discussion about empirics or evidence, it's a discussion about the culture wars and who's being left behind. So we need to be very, very mindful. To your question around how does that affect immigration and the kind of debate on hostile environment, there is a clear link there, because there's a notion that some immigrants are good and some immigrants are bad. So within immigrants, there's some that are good and some that are bad. I'm sure you know this quite well, but immigrants who've arrived here with Windrush are quite good because they work really hard and they pay their taxes and therefore they deserve a place in British society, whereas somebody who is newer, hasn't paid their taxes, isn't expected to come in and take a job here. So there's that going on. So it's dividing and rule with immigrants, traditional immigrants, but it's also then dividing white working class groups from black working class groups and immigrants in this country. So all that division and rule doesn't help anybody, but that's what we're worried about. And for that reason, Runnymede Trust, 10 years ago called for the commencement of Section 1 of the Socioeconomic Duty in the Equalities Act, because that would mean that all groups that are working class are invested in, that are protected in this country. But the government doesn't commence that legislation. Instead, it talks about white working class groups being left behind. We would rather you put your money where your mouth is. Why don't you bring about a law that protects the working classes instead of just talking about that? So it's very pervasive, it's not going away, and it's very destructive to unity and solidarity.
Anna?
Yeah, I think what I didn't understand was how that could be depoliticized, because I think it is clearly politicized. In fact, it's this old story, as Halima said, like the Runnymede Trust did that amazing who cares about the white working class 10 years ago, which is still so relevant, that really clearly spelled out this is about, it's not about that trope kind of ignores class and ignores race and somehow recreates them as this particular group that's in need. So I think it's clearly political, and in fact, and the kind of then targeting of migrants is new. Then one of the new dynamics is also not just separating out white working class, but this imagined English white working class, or what's implied by white in that, because of all the kind of racialization of EU and other migrants at the moment who are in low wage work, the kind of people Wetherspoons wanted to keep here but not with any rights. And those kind of things are clearly politics. So maybe the depoliticization is not recognizing what's political and reinserting that. And I think that the kind of the stuff around, you know, the Corbyn movement and the young social media savvy generation were really good at doing that in non-academic ways. So using kind of memes that actually pointed to some of the contradictions and some of that kind of, I think culture jamming Wetherspoons would be a really good way into that. And those kind of actions are what retell the narratives and get people to see the politics, which are really obvious in those kind of moves.
That's great, thank you. Yes, I think I probably jumbled the question a little bit, but I think you know, obviously we know that that's a political move. It's just a you know, so I think I'll take one last question. There's quite a few things that have kind of come in, and I suppose there is a question that kind of cuts across these, which is probably to do, and I know that we've talked about the hostile environment today, which is quite a UK-based issue, but some people are asking questions which are about how this kind of speaks to kind of broader hostilities towards immigration. And the example that we've particularly got here from Kayla is to do with the US and to do with, you know, if a group of countries, I suppose, like, you know, powerful countries came together to make more humane policies around immigration, do you think that that in itself would act as a lever to kind of change what's happening in the UK? Or is that just, you know, just wishful thinking in some respects? Because of course that is, we're not alone in this, but there is something quite unique about the UK.
Yeah, the premise of the question is, unfortunately, is sort of a bit cloud cuckoo land, in the sense that, you know, these policies are throughout the global north, the anti-refugee policies that I was talking about earlier, that we've all been talking about. So we're not going to get solutions from governments. I mean, okay, Biden is obviously better than Trump by a factor of 10 or whatever. But I don't think his immigration policies are any better or much better. And Obama's immigration policies were not much better. So I think we have to start with what we know, which is the potential in civil society, the potential in grassroots solidarity movements. I think we just always have to start there, because that is where the action is. That is where the understanding, the knowledge and the feelings are. And that's where we have to build from.
I thought you were going to say that's a really good way to end, Nicola. I was going to say, I think the UN has constantly, there is plenty of UN reports saying that the UK is a racist country and has racist immigration policies. So that is, I don't disagree with Francis that it's cloud cuckoo land, that nations would come together on that. But in terms of the closest thing to that, we have got that, and it makes zero difference to various UK governments. So it has to be something which has a political pressure on that comes from the grassroots, and in that way, I'd say.
Yeah, it's obvious. It's a really long. Sorry, Helena.
I agree.
I mean, I think that does. I mean, I'm very sad to kind of draw it to a close, because there are more and more questions coming in. But I am aware that it's now 6:45 and we've already gone over by 15 minutes. And I'm sure that this is a conversation that we can continue over a longer period of time. So I will hand over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for doing that's such a difficult job bringing those questions together. Thank you so much to our three speakers. I think this has been one of our finest webinars. We've had a really good series, and this is a really great ending to it. We will be back after the summer, probably remaining online, and please check our blog and Eventbrite for future events. We've recorded this. If the tech works and everything's cool with the speakers, we'll release a version of it as soon as we're able to. Our previous sessions are all online as well. If you look at the Iris Conversations with Iris YouTube channel, you'll see our previous events as well as on our blog.